Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jared Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. In this week's episode, I am talking to the writer, journalist, and commentator Rob Walker. Rob's work covers design, technology, business, the arts, and a variety of other subjects. He currently writes the Workologist column for the Sunday business section of the New York Times and has written for a variety of publications like Slate, The Atlantic, TheNewYorker.com, and Design Observer. But I first came to Rob's work when he was featured prominently in Gary Hustwit's great 2009 documentary, Objectified, that came out while I was in college, and I've been following his work ever since. In this episode, Rob and I talk about how a piece he wrote in 2003 on the then new iPod for the New York Times got him writing about design. We talk about how he thinks about writing for a general audience. And we also talk about why both critics and designers need to wrestle with the consequences of design in the world, what it was like to interview Steve Jobs, and why he's not sure he can call himself a critic. This was a really fun one for me. I'm a big fan of Rob's work and have enjoyed his writing for almost a decade now, and just really appreciate how he writes from the position of the consumer or the user or the viewer, which we talk about in this episode, but I just think adds a really important dimension to design writing, and was just so excited to finally have him on the podcast. So this is me talking to Rob Walker. I kind of want to start in potentially a weird way, or maybe a kind of maybe this is either a very weird way to start or a very kind of head-on, blunt way to start. But you've written for numerous publications on a variety of topics, kind of all over the map, and so yes. I'm kind of curious how design became a part of your beat, or where that interest in design came from. Sure.
So yeah, I've been asked this a lot, because I don't have any kind of formal background in design, and didn't set out to write about design in any way at all per se. But what happened was, I'm a journalist, and right. I had been. And I've been around a while. So kind of in the 90s, I worked in New York at various magazines as an editor. And so I was in my 20s then, and a lot of business magazines. I had kind of a business journalism background. And then in the early 2000s, I switched over to writing full-time freelance. I left New York, and I was writing for Slate. Okay. And I was doing a column for Slate called Moneybox, and within Moneybox there was a thing that I created called the ad report card, which was about advertising. So I was kind of writing about advertising and marketing was kind of this transitional step between business stuff and kind of more, mainstream general interest topics. Yeah. And this in turn led to, assignments for magazines about marketing stuff, more reported rather than the ad report card was a review column kind of thing.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So I was always reporting at the same time, like for magazines that, it was businessy stuff. But anyway, so that would lead to kind of reported stories that were kind of grounded in marketing. Like I wrote a thing about Red Bull and stuff like that. But that led to an assignment. The first kind of like design story was I got assigned by the Times Magazine. I had been an editor at the New York Times Magazine when I was in the editing part of my life. And so I knew people there, and I was doing freelance stuff for them as a writer. And I got assigned a story about the iPod, when it was like the iPod was 2 years old, and it was conceived as, not by me, it was conceived as a sort of design story, I guess. And that was, I guess, the sort of the first thing that I did that fell into that category. that later I did a column for the Times Mag. After I left Slate, I did a column for the Times Magazine called Consumed, which was about consumer culture and why we buy what we buy and things like this. And design would just come up as an element of that from time to time. And that was my introduction to the kind of design world.
Yeah.
In the sense that the design world introduced itself to me, because I wasn't really aware of all this kind of dialogue that was going on around the importance of design or whatever, like this sort of design-centric view of the world.
Yeah.
That was being explored, and not it was interesting because some people in that world embraced what I was doing, and some people really did not think I was doing it right. And they were correct that I wasn't doing it right because I was not writing for that audience. I was writing for a general audience. I did not care, and I do not care to this day, what the sort of design firmament thinks of what I have to say or whether I'm qualified. And I've you mentioned that you saw Objectified. I did events around. Went to the promotional things for Objectified, and I got asked about a lot. The people in that movie are real experts, and I got some weird looks from some people about why, they wanted to know what I was doing there. And I was like, I got invited, so.
This is funny to me.
I'm not auditioning to be in that world. But I love all those people. They're great. They're brilliant. But But I'm not coming at it from the same place.
So there's 5 things in there that I kind of want to pull out, and it's funny, because I wanted to mention Objectified because I'm pretty sure that was my first introduction to you and your work, and I think if my timeline's right, I think that came out when I was in college. So I was still new to the world also, and your segments in there really stood out to me as kind of this interesting perspective, and so I kind of started seeking out your writing after that. So I had no idea that potentially had some sort of controversy around it, but it leads to something that you said that I thought was interesting, that the design world kind of found you, or this design beat kind of found you, and that you were unaware of that. What was your consciousness around this idea of design when you were assigned that iPod piece? Did you know
I knew what any sort of reasonably educated person who keeps up with current events. Okay. You didn't have to be some sort of expert to know that the design element of the iPod was kind of a big deal. Yeah. And everybody at that time was there was a general interest in what is it about this product that has made it so successful? And how does Apple, and this was at a time when Apple was still, in a sort of comeback mode. It was this company that had been left for dead, and it was one of the sort of the secret sauce was supposed to be this thing called design, and what does that mean? And so, from a general interest, person on the street point of view, there was kind of a what's behind that? How do we break down what that is? And, so it was more that than anything else. It was more consumer culture sort of stuff, rather than sort of getting into what were the influences of, the Bauhaus on, that's not really where people were coming from, and that's not where I was coming from. So I was just, doing what the job of a journalist is to do, which is try to empathize with the audience and figure out what they want to know. So, I met with Johnny Ive and I met Steve Jobs and all that. We had all those conversations. And there was Jobs in that, for that story, was fairly, it wasn't, he wasn't very enthusiastic about me or questions, and he was fairly unfriendly. But he was somewhat eloquent on our, the design isn't how it looks, it's how it works, and this kind of stuff that I think is pretty familiar within design world, but I think was of some value to a general audience to hear. And so I was sort of, there learning that stuff along with the audience that I was writing for.
Yeah. I mean, that reminds me of, I interviewed a couple months ago, Carrie Jacobs, and she said something that stuck with me, where that she basically said, I write about design because I really want to be a kind of generalist writer, and design is a way that I can kind of end up talking about all the things that I'm really interested in. And it sounds like that might be similar to you. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that the cleverness of being, I would say the same thing about marketing.
Yeah.
Or, I mean, there's just different ways of, and it's yeah, I think it's not unusual. Everybody wants to write about everything, I suppose. And so you try to take whatever your field of expertise is and angle it in ways that will allow you to get wherever you want to go. And, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. It's better to just be like just in Malcolm Gladwell or Michael Lewis and be incredibly talented and successful or whatever.
Yeah.
And then you can do whatever you want. That's better. That's a better strategy. But I don't have the talent.
Well, I think there's some of that in your work, actually. But that actually comes back to
the talent.
Well, I don't know about that. The other thing that you said, though, that kind of relates to that, actually, that I thought was interesting is you, from the beginning, were writing for a general audience, for a non-design audience, and that you really don't care what the design crowd or the people that study design, that's not who you're writing for. And that's, I'm not surprised to hear you say that, because over the last week or so, as I've been rereading a lot of your work to prepare for this, I was struck by how often you write from the position of the consumer or the user or the person who's encountering this. And it's very much about kind of design in the world, instead of writing about it as this kind of singular artifact or this, art object. And I guess I'm kind of curious how you think about, I'm not sure exactly how to phrase what I'm trying to ask. Taking your work and thinking about writing from that point of view to that audience, what are your kind of goals in writing? Is it kind of educating the audience? Is it journalism? Is it criticism? Like, how do you kind of parse out what your job is in writing about design? You know what I mean? I'm struggling to articulate this, but okay.
Yeah. First, I want to just say, I say, I don't care about. I mean, I don't want to sound like a jerk about it. I don't think I'm better than anybody or whatever. It's not my. To answer your question, like what I'm trying to do, 9 times out of 10, what it comes down to is demystification. I'm trying to say, like with the iPod, that story is an example, or with any of these things, it's sort of like, whether you're a designer or a technologist or a marketer, you have an interest in mystifying your talent in some way, to make it seem as rarefied and special as possible.
Yeah.
That's to your advantage, right? And to make it so that you have the expertise and the secret shamanistic abilities that others lack.
Right.
So you get more clients, right? I don't care about any of that, right?
So
my job is to demystify. So I don't want to get hung up. So when I say I don't care about it, it's like I don't want to get in a position where if I'm writing, I'm thinking about what will a design expert think about what I'm saying here. That's kind of if I'm writing for that audience, it becomes really limiting, and you end up like you end up not demystifying, but just sort of further participating in this process that isn't educational to a lay reader. You can write in a way that's educational to, or one can write in a way that is educational to an expert audience. But I'm not that writer. There are plenty of people who have that deep background. They've really studied this stuff, and they really, they want to write for a professional designer, an audience of other designers or of other design experts.
Yeah.
And there's just a big difference between trying to write for an audience of experts and trying to write for a lay audience, and to say to them something that to make them a little bit smarter than they were about this subject. Not to give them a seminar, but to say here's a little insight into how these things.
That reminds me of the piece you wrote in the New Yorker about the Netflix series Abstract, which I watched all of that and really struggled with it because I so clearly was not the audience because I was in that world, and so I didn't. I'm not saying I don't want this to sound arrogant, but I didn't learn anything new in that, and it felt like it was making design this kind of magical thing, and it wasn't the show. I'll be honest, it just wasn't the show that I wanted it to be. But I had a hard time trying to figure out what someone who wasn't a designer would take away from that. And I thought your piece there did a really nice job because it in a way, I think Abstract was kind of trying to make design seem like this magical thing like you're talking about. And you said very clearly it doesn't really wrestle with any of the implications of these things.
No.
And
it's the point of that series was largely it was for people who really don't know anything, but it wasn't demystifying. It was It was like, design is a neat thing.
Right. And I think that's what's interesting though, is that the word design has become this kind of buzzword now. Yeah. And, design is this thing that's kind of like sprinkled in all of these other fields now to make it seem, new or innovative or something like that. And it's this word that the general audience now is aware of. And I'm even thinking specifically graphic design, and I talk about this with a lot of the people I have on the podcast, but when a company redesigns their logo and everyone has an opinion on it now, and that's a thing people are aware of, has that changed how you think about your job or how you write about these things? This kind of new consciousness or this greater consciousness around it?
That's interesting. I don't know how much. I mean, it has had the effect of certainly like you can't get away anymore with like sort of doing these. I mean, that was what was funny about the abstract thing is that like, hey, there's this thing called design. Like you can't really get away with that for very long anymore. You have to sort of try to take it somewhere. Yeah. I don't know that. I mean, I think that the sort of pop culture. I don't, a sort of acceptance or awareness of design and like people reviewing logos on Twitter or whatever, that kind of thing. I don't know how much effect that's really had on the way I approach this stuff. I think it has helped. I think there's more of an audience now. I know that there's a lot of discussion. I think that that's more of a, actually this is an issue that I think is more of an issue for people who are more deeply entrenched in design world than I am. Because I know that there's been a lot of debate about, isn't it horrible or is it great that the masses are reviewing? And I don't even. I just, to me, there's not that much to talk about. It's like if wasn't this the idea? You wanted design to be treated like any other important subject. So that's what's happening.
Right.
And as as someone who as a journalist who has spent upwards of 20 years living in the world of the masses picking on my profession, I don't really take that seriously. It's like this is how it is. So there's not really that much to talk about. If you're going to do things in public, then the public is going to have things to say back to you. And that's the whole story.
Yeah. I mean, I had read, I somehow missed this when you had written it originally, and I'm sorry to just bring up all of these old pieces, on the spot, like challenge you like this on the spot, but a piece you had written for Design Observer, I think it was called Crit Rage, that was in response to something you had written for Fast Company about the Yahoo logo, and how that this was actually a good time for design, that this is not the end of design writing that everyone's talking about this, but it's actually a very interesting time. And I feel like it's only progressed even more. I think that was 4 or 5 years ago now.
Oh, yeah. There's way more design writing around now than there was. I mean, way more, I think. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like I see it more, and more good stuff's being done. And
I mean, do you think something I think about a lot, and again, this is hard for me because I am so in this world, is that it almost feels like the definition of design is expanding. And especially in graphic design, when I was in school, it was you make logos, you make books, you make posters. That's kind of it. You work for clients, you make some websites. And now it's just, design systems and community design. Does that... do you see that from your perspective, and does that kind of change the subjects that you're writing about?
The sort of expansion of what design means.
Yeah,
sure. I mean, it's become kind of sprawling. It's complicated, and it's I don't know how much it affects what I do or don't do. I think that I've said versions of this before. I think that, this word design, there's 10 or 15 years ago, there was this yearning to get design, like design needs to be taken seriously, which we sort of talked about. But sort of simultaneously, what the urge is like, well, do you want it to be taken seriously, or do you just want it to be applauded?
Right.
Because those are two different things. And there's such a powerful push to make design virtuous, like intrinsically virtuous.
Yeah.
And that's what leads to it being expanded all over the place into like, social design and all this kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. Now, I guess I don't have a problem with that. I mean, but I have always felt, and I've said this many a different contexts, that design to me is not intrinsically good. It's morally neutral idea. And the Kalashnikov is one of the most well-designed objects, famously, of all time. And Slot Machine is an unbelievable masterpiece of design. It's not good for society, but it's amazing design. Now some people will say, like, well, if it's bad for society, then it can't be good design. I don't agree with that. I think design is morally neutral, and it's whatever you do with it can be good, bad, indifferent, or somewhere in between. And we're in an interesting moment on that right now because of the way people are starting to talk about, Facebook and all this stuff. Suddenly things that were being applauded 5 years ago are being booed. And it's like, well, it's the same stuff.
Right. Yeah, nothing's changed.
So I think maybe we're finally going to get to the crossroads of accepting that, design isn't always a force for good. I mean, and MoMA, Paul Antonelli has done some good things. I think the Design and Violence show was one of the most important things that's happened in that world in the last 5 or 10 years, because it's sort of starting to grapple with that in ways that are more, I think, long-term productive than just the constant sort of applauding the latest Eve Behar thing or whatever.
Right. Yeah. I mean,
Eve Behar, whatever. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, this is exactly. I feel like this idea is kind of where a lot of this podcast came out of. And we're kind of talking about a lot of the my own trajectory in thinking about this, because when I started this podcast, my thought was that there weren't enough people writing about design. And I very quickly realized that that was not true at all, that there are more people writing about design than ever before, probably, and talking about design than ever before. And what I realized I was craving was so much of design writing, and again, I'm speaking kind of specifically about graphic design, but I think, what you're saying applies to all of it, is that it's this kind of quick aesthetic judgment. It's, is this new thing beautiful or not beautiful? Is this new logo good or bad? And it is this kind of thinking of design being this virtuous thing. And what I'm interested in, or what I think I was interested in when I was looking for these answers, and increasingly the type of design writing that I'm seeking out, is this writing that really wrestles with the implications of these objects in the world. How do these things affect the culture that they're put into, but then also what do these objects tell us about the culture that they came out of, and the actual kind of process that led to them. And so I'm really interested in this that thing that you said about design itself being neutral, but it's how we use it, or how it lives. And I kind of, I don't know if I really have a question there, other than I would like to hear you talk more about that idea, because I think it's something that's really interesting.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's
that was a horrible setup for an answer, but
well, I'll go back to I think that, like I say, I think we're grappling with it now with some of the social media stuff. And I just read something yesterday, I think, that was comparing Facebook and Instagram.
Oh yeah. I read that also.
And, there were just a couple of interesting points that were made in it. The one that I thought was most interesting was how Instagram is designed, not like Facebook is designed to share, to pass along things, and you don't really pass things along in Instagram, or I guess you can through third-party apps, but really it's like you communicating directly with whoever you've chosen to communicate with, as opposed things don't go viral on Instagram the way things go viral on Facebook. And so that's like a design decision that so those are two separate design decisions that were made. And, I think that the idea of shareability was a highly prized feature.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of striking to see it now being characterized as some sort of a problem.
Right.
This is one of because now people they're not sharing good, positive, fuzzy things. They're sharing phony Russian propaganda or whatever it is. Right. So now yesterday's feature is today's bug. And, I think that kind of thinking about that stuff, is something you can only do if you get past this idea that something that is kind of successful is therefore good, automatically good. Things can be successful, and this is obvious in every other in every other cultural category. So it needs to be just as obvious in design. That's something that is a wildly successful piece of interaction design. The shareability, the way that shareability is enabled and encouraged on Facebook is great if good things are being shared.
Right.
If not, then it's potentially catastrophic.
Right.
And there's this sort of naivete about the way this stuff is usually discussed, and we're sort of wrestling with it. As I say, we're wrestling with it now in the social media world. I'm not sure that I buy the idea there's this huge backlash going on, but it's at least being considered seriously. I mean, not I've joked that it's what we're learning is the trouble with everybody. That, if you remember there was a book called Here Comes Everybody that was about, isn't it great? Now everyone's part. It's the bad news is here comes everybody.
Right.
So everybody means everybody. and that's not an intrinsically good thing. So a lot of the things I'm saying about design world are true of tech world too, which is kind of where I spent. I mean, writing about design is actually not that big a part of my practice anymore. I kind of
I like that we get to that halfway through the conversation.
Yeah, well, I'm just being honest that I sort of switched to more writing about technology stuff and then sort of work and things. But so just sort of disclosing that. But there's, these things all overlap, and I like trying to bring together the different perspectives. And the background in business journalism is really important to everything I do now. It's part of what gave me a different perspective on it.
Yeah, I mean, and I think, I think you're writing about technology or work. That's kind of one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you, is because there is so much overlap with design, and oftentimes the things that are talked about or written about in regards to tech very much affect design and graphic designers, but somehow that bridge never gets crossed. And I'm thinking about Facebook, and I'm thinking about fake news is kind of very core to the fake news problem is a graphic design problem. And it's that context is stripped away. It's that everything looks the same. It's that everybody has the tools to make things that look real. And I maybe I'm not looking in the right places, but I feel like graphic designers aren't asking these questions, or how graphic design is either implicit in this or could think about this in new ways. It's being talked about in technology and media, but when's that come back over to design?
Yeah, you would know better than I do what conversations are. I mean, I definitely see that stuff talked about, but I guess it's maybe more in the technology realm that they're certainly. I think people have come to have made this point that the Facebook's sort of flattening, or any social media platforms, this sort of way that they flatten everything into one clean, consistent aesthetic. It has a real effect on how things are perceived, and I think that was seen as a good thing not that long ago. That that it was a way of smashing the gatekeepers and all that kind of stuff.
Right. I mean, I'd even go a step further and look at services like Squarespace, where anyone can make a website that looks good, and that I think largely is seen as a good thing, and it probably is, but then it also lets people create really nice looking professional websites for things that maybe are not those things. Or
even less nefariously, just people who don't really have who really aren't that professional. But that's definitely, I mean, it's been the holy grail for as long as we've been, like, since like the Netscape or moment of easy plug and play. You can do something that looks as good as the New York Times with no effort.
Right. One of the questions that I ask everybody as we start to head into the kind of final part of the conversation is something that we've kind of been talking about through all of this. So I'm going to ask it to you in two ways. The first is, what are the topics that you think are kind of important for designers to be talking about today, or important to the design discourse? And that's kind of what we've been talking about. So I'm curious if there are other things that you think are relevant right now or should be talked about. And then the second way I'm going to ask it is more specifically to you, or what are the topics, design or not, that you're really interested in right now, or that you're kind of exploring right now in your work?
Okay, so I guess for the first one, I think, we have sort of covered that. I think that there should be more thought to I mean, it sounds corny to say consequences or whatever, because people sort of talk about that all the time. But I mean, just to more continue to grapple with the idea, like let's get beyond, let's declare victory on the idea that design is taken seriously.
Yeah.
Or is recognized, and like let's really start to take it seriously in the sense of not just this sort of like let's look at the negative consequences. Let's look at great design that's also bad and why. And that's happening. I don't want to make it sound like
right.
I want to be careful that I'm not sort of there are serious critics out there and
of course,
who deal with this stuff in very serious ways and in big venues and in real and in hardcore design venues, whatever. Like it's not like I don't want to sound like I'm this one lonely voice who's got the
right.
But that's my point of view. So I think that, and I think maybe humility is a theme that I teach a little bit, and I would like to see in the design curriculum. I guess a little bit more. There's a little bit of and this is partly like design, like so. Design is also a business, right? And I don't want to get into naming, but like there are big design firms out there who have an intrinsic interest in saying, you know what, companies, governments, what everybody really needs is, and that's where this design thinking idea, like you need this design thinking and like every problem in the world, really what it needs is design to come in.
Yeah.
And I would like to sort of see a little bit more humility that like, actually it kind of works the other way too, that there's really nothing that design can do without drawing on other people's expertise in other fields, and to maybe stop marginalizing the importance of
I love
actual
that.
experts in other fields. So those two things. As far as my work, I am we're doing a book that I'm sort of in the middle of, so it won't be out for a long time.
Okay.
But it's about attention and noticing and
interesting.
Things like that. So I don't really want to go on about it at great length, but those sort of general subjects are where my head is at these days, and it kind of comes down to like trying to pay attention to what's being overlooked and underrated and not paid enough attention to, and trying to reclaim some individuality in the way that one. And this is, you've heard the term attention economy and all this kind of stuff. And so I'm not writing about the problem. I'm writing about ways to on an individual level cope with it.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So.
I'm curious. I don't want this question to be too reductive, but I'm curious. You were just talking about how there are serious critics out there who are kind of doing that stuff that we're talking about, and you've referred to your work as journalism, and I'm curious if you see a difference between journalism and criticism. Or do you approach those differently?
Yeah, okay, that's a good question. And like, I guess that because clearly a lot of what I was sort of raised as a journalist, as it were, like professionally. Like, that's my background. But like some of what I do really isn't like it really is just like, here's what I think. Yeah. So I tend to call that kind of work when I'm doing it, I call it commentary. And that's I'm a little scared of the word critic. Okay. Because I don't think I have the background for it. I don't think I'm qualified to call myself a critic, and I'm not being falsely modest. I just don't think my work quite fits in that category. I think it's more like when I'm doing non-journalistic stuff, it's more like commentary. Okay. So there are other people but they're, to answer, it's like a continuum, because like you mentioned, Carrie Jacobs, like her work is both journalistic and critical, I think. Right. And obviously like Michael Kimmelman and, Alexandra Lang and like people like that, they're sort of doing both, and occasionally I do stuff that falls that way. It really depends. It depends on the assignment and depends on the editor. But I don't think that I have quite that. That's not exactly I'm not really a critic. It's not really my brand, as it were. Right. So
okay. I mean, the reason I was asking is I've talked to a lot of curators recently, and I've been kind of talking to them about the difference between being a curator and being a critic, and this idea of kind of selecting objects for a show and how they bring in how much of their own point of view they bring in, or how much of their opinion around things they bring in. And I was kind of curious how you think about that in regards to a piece of journalism. And so I think this idea of commentary actually kind of answers that question.
Yeah, and I mean the other way to for me with that, it's less in some ways like I remember when I was writing Consumed, I would get this a lot, and I still get it for other things I do. It's like that I don't quite say what I think. Sometimes maybe as direct, like I don't give you the thumbs up, thumbs down thing. And I think it's because I don't see that as necessarily my role, and people aren't necessarily reading my work to find out what I think.
Yeah.
On the other hand, the truth is that my work is 100% about what I think. It's like all guided by like the subjects I choose,
right,
the way I approach them. But just because I don't say yay or nay, like there's more to having a point of view than that.
Right.
So I think that everything I do is guided by a sensibility, but it's not a sensibility that is literally like, like Michael Kimmel, like people read his stuff because they want to know what he thinks. I don't think people read me that way.
Okay.
I don't.
Yeah. But I mean, do you, and I don't, but I guess I'm curious, when you're writing something for, the New Yorker, for example, and it's kind of a reporting piece. How do you think about how much of your opinion on those things make their way into it? Whether you do think it's a good thing or a bad thing. I know that's kind of what you were just saying, but is that something you're conscious of? Are any of your biases coming into this, or they're just always there?
Okay, so let me use, first of all, so the stuff I've done a few things for the New Yorker's website.
Right.
So, and none of those were really heavily reported, but so let's take the last long thing I did was for Fortune, and it was about sort of the state of the logo.
Right, that's right. I remember that.
Right, so that's like a reported piece. And, is there a moment of that piece of me saying this is a good logo, this is a bad logo? No.
Right.
But is it point of view driven? I think so. I have my points to make about, I think I'm making arguments about why the logo, why the logo has changed the way it has, and things like this.
Yeah.
And I think it's informed by a point of view, and I think that you could find things in there that are kind of me asserting something, but it's not in the sense of me saying that Target has the best logo and Walmart has the dumb one or something like that.
Right. That makes sense.
That's not my thing.
Rob, thank you so much. This was like I said, I've been reading you now for, I don't know, almost a decade or so. And I'm a big fan of your work and your writing, and had been wanting to talk to you basically since I started this podcast, and thought that this was so great and interesting. So thank you so much for your time.
Well, you're welcome. You're very kind.
This episode was recorded on January 24th, 2018. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us on Apple Podcasts and SoundCloud, and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.